This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Welcome back, everyone, to World to Win. I'm Toya, and I know you're expecting to see Yara on screen with me, but this week we're changing it up a little bit. So today we have Dara with us. Now, Dara, let me tell you a little bit about him. He has been on World to Win a lot. You've just never seen him. He's been behind the screens. I know Dara. He used to live in the US. He left us, unfortunately, and moved to the UK. Yara met him, and we were like, you know what? Let's bring Dara on. He's great. He's funny. He's so smart. He does a lot of work for World to Win. So with that introduction, Dara, welcome to World to Win. Finally, you're here with us. How have you been?
Good. Yeah, good. Jeez, that's some introduction. I don't think I can live up to that, and probably a bit more comfortable on the other side of the camera, but delighted to be here.
Well, everyone's expecting you to tell jokes, so make sure you prepare for some. But I'm so glad to have you here today. Our first guest this week is Geert, who is the editor of the ISA paper in Belgium. We're called PSL there. Geert, welcome back. How have you been?
Thank you. I'm fine.
What have you been up to lately?
Well, the 8th of March was quite impressive here in Belgium with the protests we helped to organize. And we immediately after the 8th of March produced an anti-war issue of our paper. So we know how to fill our days, yeah.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned anti-war because I forgot to even say what this episode is about. This is our 4th episode in a series about the war in Ukraine. So I'm glad you're able to talk with us today, Geert. And then we also have Connor on. Now, Connor is the host of the Revolutionary Ideas podcast. So I'm very excited to have him on today. I love your show, Connor. So what have you been up to recently?
Other than recording Revolutionary Ideas, I've been very involved in some of the protests that have been happening over here as well as part of the anti-war movement. I think this is something that is, incredibly important that we talk about here today, and that we're engaging in on the streets as well. And I'm also looking forward to hearing these jokes from Dara.
Yeah, a lot of pressure for Dara today. Like I said, this is our 4th episode on the war in Ukraine, which I'm sure everyone has been watching, whether that be reading about it, seeing it on social media, following very closely. It's a scary time. Over the course of the past few weeks, we've discussed the war in Ukraine from different angles. We've discussed the roots of the war. We've discussed how it's taking place in the context of the capitalist crisis, and the sharpening of the inter-imperialist tensions. So if you haven't seen those episodes or listened to them, make sure you go back so you can hear our full analysis. We've also discussed the type of anti-war movement that is necessary to really fight back against war in general, and specifically this war. And throughout these episodes, we've touched on how the socialist movement has confronted the question at war at different times throughout history. But today we wanted to do a more full episode to talk about some of the rich lessons and the relevance of the socialist fight back anti-war movements and a Marxist analysis to fully better understand the situation today. So I want to start with you, Geert, talking about, sorry, I'm going to do that one again. Hold on a second. So I'm going to start with you, Geert. The explanations for wars, in the past and the present that we hear from media and from establishment politicians, tend to be more superficial. For example, when we learn about World War I, they talk about it was the assassination of that Ferdinand guy. World War II was fighting the Nazis, good, evil. And there's countless other imperialist invasions that are justified as, defending democracy and fighting for human rights. But as Marxists, we look to more profound historical forces to explain these events. For example, French socialist Jean Jaurès wrote over 100 years ago that capitalism carries in it war, just like clouds carry rain. So, Geert, can you explain what exactly he meant by this and how Marxists understand war as a natural outgrowth of capitalism?
Yes, well, it's not only socialists who recognize that war is the continuation of politics by other means. But of course, socialists point out that the capitalist system and all its contradictions are the political basis, and that those contradictions are leading to war. So it's not the work of one madman or one people that would be in itself more into war. It's the whole system. And that's important for us, that it's not separated from class and from social relations of society. War is rather an expression of it. And when Jean Jaurès made his statement, when he explained that capitalism carries war in itself, like dark clouds carry rain in itself, in fact, that was the position that was official in the socialist movement before the war. The difference is, Jean Jaurès, he continued to say it at the moment when it was clear that the war would break out. At the moment when most of the others in the socialist movement, they had forgotten what they had voted on the international conferences. For them, it was only in words that they were against the war. For Jean Jaurès, it was clear. It was more clear that stopping the war would also mean not only accepting that capitalism leads to war, but also putting a solution to it, saying that the working class should oppose the war by all possible means, including general strikes, including armed revolt, and so on. That was not accepted by the majority in the socialist movement, who would later betray the movement. Now, Jean Jaurès was not a revolutionary Marxist. He was an honest socialist who opposed the war. He was murdered just before the start of the war because he took a consistent position. But it's clear that his ideas were a bit isolated in the movement. At the moment when the war started. On the other hand, revolutionary socialists like Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg, Liebknecht, Zetkin, they all continue to defend that internationalist position at the outbreak of the war. They built on the analysis of how capitalism functions as elaborated by Marx and Engels. They continue to explain that capitalist states are in competition with each other, try to gain a stronger position, try to get better profits for their own capitalists. And that was what it was all about. In a world that was completely dominated by the different imperialist forces, this meant that those forces had to fight each other to advance their own position. So it's no coincidence that it's during the First World War that Lenin finished his study on imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, because that was necessary to understand. Imperialism led to the First World War, so it was necessary to understand that new period, that new stage of capitalism, the highest stage of capitalism that was developing and leading to this war. This understanding of how capitalism works is, of course, necessary to be able to stop it, to stop the barbarism, to stop the misery that is being produced by the war. And it's like Trotsky said in his text, The War and the International. He said, this First World War is the most colossal breakdown in history of an economical system that is destroyed by its own inherent contradictions. And that's an important point to make. It's the contradictions of capitalism that lead to war, and the working class has to put its own method against it, and that's the method of social revolution. That is the only solution that the working class can really put forward as a solution for the war and its consequences for the class.
What's crazy to me, Geert, is the similarities to what happened, 100 years ago. As you're talking about this quote was written, at the start of World War I. But these lessons that you're drawing out, that war is inevitable in capitalism, and Lenin's analysis of imperialism and the effects that it's going to have, and the need for the working class to unite to stop it. Is that still relevant, today, in your opinion? And can you explain a little bit how, if you think so?
Of course it is, yes. It's important to note that the war in Ukraine has its origins in the specific conditions of world capitalism today. This is the fourth episode of World to Win on Ukraine, but there has been plenty of episodes discussing the specific elements of world capitalism today. And in fact, those episodes are necessary as well to understand what is happening today in Ukraine and in this war. Of course, the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, will still try to present what is happening as the work of just one figure or a clique around that one person of Vladimir Putin. And they have all the interest of doing so, because if it's all the fault of just one person, then we don't have to look at the whole system that is behind it. If it's Putin's fault, then, well, we shouldn't look at the failure of capitalism. It's even used here in Europe to explain the rising inflation. The working class today is suffering under the high prices for energy, fuel, the starting inflation of the food prices. And the ruling class tried to present this as the result of Putin's war, not the result of failing capitalism, even when the prices were already skyrocketing before this war started. So this presentation is important for them, and it has an effect on consciousness. People go along with these ideas, but we have to explain that this is not the work of just one person. It's a specific situation of world capitalism, a context that is there, that is being used by all involved in this conflict, not only by the Russian regime around Putin, the NATO and US imperialism, Western imperialism. For them as well, every crisis is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to expand NATO, to spend more resources on the military. So they use the occasion to strengthen their own position in terms of profits, but also in terms of spheres of influence. So it's clear that a war still today means profits on the one hand and misery and destruction on the other hand. It means destruction of things that have been built by the hands of the working class. It also means misery. One of the first anti-war conferences at the time of the First World War was the Women's Conference. Clara Zetkin, who was one of the organizers, the German Marxist Clara Zetkin, she said at that meeting that hunger is the twin sister of war, meaning that war always comes with misery for the majority of the people, and that is still the same. But for us it's important to explain the context today, a context of the new Cold War between the US and China, a Cold War between capitalist regimes that is developing at the moment, that all the hope that neoliberal globalization would bring unlimited growth and harmony in the world, that hope has been shattered. The Great Recession, more than 10 years ago, broke the previous balance between the US and China became increasingly a challenger to the United States. The consequences of the pandemic have accelerated all the processes that were happening, and for us it's important to make the basic point that the basis for this new Cold War is the deadlock of capitalism and the crisis of both superpowers. At the moment when there's growing tension between the US and China, a divided European Union, Russian imperialism in decay that saw some opportunities because the mass movements in Belarus and Kazakhstan didn't develop further, and it was possible to have repression to stop those movements. That created the conditions in which it was possible for the Russian regime to start this war. So we have to look at the whole system, the whole. We have to look at the whole movie, not just one photograph. And we also have to make the point, of course, that the consequences for the Ukrainian people do not really count in all the geopolitical calculations on both sides. Not for the Russian regime, but also not for NATO and Western imperialism. We have to make clear that without an analysis of capitalism today, it's not possible to understand why it came to this war at this moment. And that understanding is necessary if we want to really go against it, if we really want to stop this war, and that's possible. I mean, the key to change is still in mass movements against the war, is still in mass movements for a different system. I mean, revolutionary change to end the system is still what is on the agenda. And we can continue to build on ideas that are already present in the movement. I mean, in the protests against racism and sexism, a lot of people agreed when we say that the whole system is guilty. It's not always clear for everybody what this system is. We understand it as the capitalist production system, but it's true, it's the whole system that is guilty. Also in this situation of war, we have to change the whole system. It's still about revolutionary struggle for socialist society. That is still the challenge that we have in front of us. So in that sense, the conclusions or the analysis that Marxists made more than 100 years ago are still very, very relevant today in the situation of war happening in Europe.
Thanks very much, Geert, for that excellent analysis and really, showing that how Marxist ideas can be dynamically applied to the present to make sense of a new situation, but in which you see many tendencies we saw also that Lenin was analysing at the turn of the century. So I think that was really good. You also mentioned about the importance of these ideas and the, previous movements and how they've taken these ideas up to combat other forms of repression, other features of capitalist society. So I think there's some really interesting lessons there, both how socialists got it right using this analysis, but also, sadly, how they got it wrong. Now, you mentioned at the beginning of the interview about some of the socialist parties at the beginning of the 20th century. And I want to go to Connor now to just develop this out a bit more, because at that time, the beginning of the 20th century, you had mass socialist parties across Europe organized in the Second International, which had an enormous weight in society. Kind of hard to imagine from today's perspective, the sheer size. And although these based themselves, many of the leading figures, on the ideas of Marx and Engels, who are also opposed to war, and these figures too were anti-war in words. When World War I broke out, we saw many of them instantly bent to pressures to support their own national governments in the war effort. Now, it's actually that Lenin, leader of the Bolsheviks and Russian Revolution, when he got news of this, he thought it was a hoax. And you wouldn't blame him. Here's a figure who based his politics, who saw Marxism and the socialist movement, a cornerstone of that being the internationalism of the working class. Here is figures he had admired, drew inspiration from, that were supporting their own national government in the war effort. So quite a shocking moment for Lenin, but for lots of other socialists, and sometimes difficult to understand from today's perspective. So, Connor, can you just explain how could it be the case that people part of a movement committed to fighting for a world free of war, free of poverty, free of oppression, could commit such a fatal error? And then what impact did this have on the socialist movement at the time?
Yeah, I mean, it's shocking, isn't it, when you think about it? And you can absolutely understand why Lenin thought it would have thought it was a hoax. In fact, so did the leadership of the Romanian section of the Second International. They didn't believe the reports when they came in. Because right up until the war, these organizations in the Second International were across the board supporting, at least in words, the idea of fighting against the war, against war in general, and for international working class solidarity, even at as close to the war as 1911, around the time of the Balkan Wars at the time. The Second International's conference agreed an anti-war manifesto. It pointed the finger at the profits of the capitalists as the root cause of these kinds of imperialist wars. And they made the point that socialists have a duty to intervene in favor of ending that war and using all of the resources, all of the powers that we have available to us in the workers' movement to also use the crisis, the political crisis that war generates for the ruling class to actually to build a movement and to build a movement to end capitalism. At the same time, the Second International was a very mixed organization. So you had revolutionaries like Lenin in it, but there were also reformists and people whose aim was not even really to end capitalism, but to reform capitalism. So when the war came, there were these huge pressures on everyone in the socialist movement, right? And that was a pressure that came from the top, from the ruling class, who put forward a big amount of propaganda, saying that the leaders of the workers' organizations had to get behind their governments, not undermine the war effort. And at the same time, there was this conscious whipping up from the ruling class of nationalism in the working class itself. So exploiting, for instance, old national divisions between nations and similar kind of populist, demagogic kind of tactics to try and build working class support for the war, whether that was here in Britain to defend poor little Belgium, or for defense of the fatherland, or other things like this. And these big pressures, they did have a big effect on the leaders of the workers' parties in the Second International. But especially, it built a window for the opportunist leaders who were there already, who were already playing a role in the previous period of holding back struggle, but who were massively strengthened by this kind of national unity mood of backing the governments, this idea of a kind of need for a civil peace while the war goes on. And so they really kind of gained a decisive kind of advantage in this situation, where they had a kind of excuse to not be putting up a fight against the ruling class, to be holding back struggle, and so on. And you did see almost kind of overnight these parties of the Second International, under these pressures, and with these kind of frankly treacherous leaderships, caved to the pressure that they were under, and from at least on paper adhering to this idea that, as Marx and Engels said in the Communist Manifesto, that the workers have no fatherland. Well, the Second International's leaders swallowed completely the exact opposite, the idea that we have to defend the fatherland. And what was particularly shocking, I think, actually, especially for someone like Lenin, was the SPD, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, which was kind of the shining star of the international workers' movement for the whole previous historical period. It was a truly mass organization, at least in theory, adhering to Marxism, and had just won a third of the vote in the previous elections. It was really kind of the leading force of the socialist movement in Europe, but it ended up voting to fund the war in the Reichstag. So putting forward war credits to fund the war. And that was agreed by the deputies of the SPD almost unanimously, famously with Karl Liebknecht, who went on to become one of the leaders of the German Revolution as one of the only deputies opposing that move. But you called it like a fatal error, and that is literally true, right? This signaled the end of the Second International, essentially, as an organization which was built to represent the interests of the international working class across borders, but had fallen apart basically following this turn. Parties that were once standing together based on this international solidarity were now alongside their ruling classes, which are always divided on national basis. Well, these parties were now at war with each other, literally. And you had SPD members from Germany shooting French Socialist Party members in the trenches with the full support of the leaders of the workers' movement in those countries. Lenin described the Second International, even before it officially dissolved, as a stinking corpse. And you can see why, can't you?
Thanks for that, Connor. I think that analysis is particularly helpful, that historical analysis, to understand the situation today, where, in many countries we're seeing, particularly Western countries, we're seeing the propaganda machine in full swing in favor for war, in favor of increasing intervention, to large part to do with distracting away from domestic problems, but also that does have a real impact on the consciousness of working class people. Now, at that point in time, obviously this is a huge betrayal for the socialist movement, but there was a small but significant group of revolutionaries, of Marxists, that did remain implacable opponents to the war. Can you explain who these were and what position they put forward in the context of a war, but also the context of a betrayal of their former comrades?
Yeah, of course. They were in this isolated position, as you said, but there were these scattered groups that maintained opposition to the war in Russia, Bulgaria, and Serbia, sections who never switched to supporting the war. The Romanian Marxists, despite being cracked down on by their government, began operating underground in opposition to the war. At the same time, you had opponents to the war in the Social Democratic Party in Germany. Karl Liebknecht, who we just mentioned, who opposed the war, began organising alongside people like Rosa Luxemburg. In Britain, even, you had the Independent Labour Party and the British Socialist Party, who, were both affiliated to the Second International and who both began organising against the war. But it was, and this has to be stressed, it was a small group at the time, a very, very isolated group of socialists internationally, facing up against this huge wave of kind of nationalism and reaction. But they did try and coordinate. They tried to bring themselves together internationally to be able to put forward these anti-war ideas and build a movement against war and imperialism and capitalism. At the same time as the workers' movement's leadership was lining up with the ruling class on these ideas. So what was organised was called the Zimmerwald Conference. It took place in Zimmerwald, which is where it got the name from. But basically a conference of anti-war socialists trying to maintain the idea of working class internationalism. And they put out a manifesto following the conference, an appeal to the workers of the world, trying to expose the war for its imperialist character and really kind of laying the first seeds of an anti-war left at the conference. They kind of called on workers, in all of the belligerent countries to unite. They echoed the words of the Communist Manifesto, workers of all countries unite. And that's how they closed off their own manifesto. What I think is actually more crucial, though, is the grouping at the conference around Lenin and others that were kind of on the left of the conference that wanted to go even further than just this. They thought that it would be crucial that we make a direct criticism of this opportunism of the Second International that led the working class into this war, and to flesh out how we can actually build an anti-war struggle in spite of them, and that this has to be linked to a mass movement to overthrow this system, the system that breeds this war. And it was especially kind of this group, what was kind of called the Zimmerwald left, as opposed to the right at this conference, who rejected the war purely out of a kind of vague pacifism rather than a kind of serious revolutionary internationalism. But it was this group that would lay the basis for the revolutionary movements that actually eventually brought an end to the First World War only 4 years later. And Lenin especially waged a big struggle to try and convince those in the socialist movement of the importance of taking a class position in this war. He made the point that, struggle doesn't die away. All these kind of crises of capitalism don't die away when a war starts. But actually these things are there waiting to break back out. And as that nationalist propaganda that we see is shown to be paper thin, when reality workers are being killed en masse, are being super exploited to support the war effort, and being told to put up with all these kind of terrible things because it's in the national interest or whatever. Meanwhile, the ruling class is prospering out of all this. It highlights that class struggle isn't overawed by war. It's actually sharpened, and workers, have a tendency to realize that that's the case. And that, as a result, the struggle against the war is not about kind of an abstract struggle for peace. It's about the urgent need to actually overthrow this system that's breeding these wars. And that is the case today. The ruling class is trying to kind of plaster over the ongoing crises of their system, the ongoing class struggle, whether that's, I think it's actually most clearly expressed in like the cost of living crisis, the crisis we're having around oil. And, we've got leaders, our government here, the Tories, are saying, this is the price that we've got to pay to stand up to Putin. Think about those poor people in Ukraine who are suffering so much more than you. This cost of living crisis was going on well before the war. And it's not because of Putin that this is happening. It's because of the crisis. Likewise with the climate crisis, they're, looking at drilling in the North Sea for fossil fuels to try and get away from using Russian oil. Meanwhile, putting forward no solutions to the climate crisis, essentially putting net zero in the bin. These problems don't go away when a war starts, and people will be aware of these things, and they will, lead to anticipation of that national unity mood, which, often starts at the beginning of a war, but, quickly actually falls apart.
Connor, you were talking about what Lenin had to do to actually convince people that we needed to be united against the war, as opposed to having this nationalistic approach of, defending the fatherland, as you said. He had, when we think about the successes of Lenin and Trotsky, you oftentimes forget how difficult it was for them to have to convince people, going against the capitalist propaganda machine. But, we're talking about this war, and we're talking about wars of the past, and acknowledging, the unbearable misery that war brings, specifically to the working class, to the poor. We're seeing examples of who's really, not really, but who is disproportionately bearing the burden of the war in Ukraine. You see mothers and children having to cross the border, while the rich capitalists are able to safely get out and have supplies, etc. And there's tons of destruction and bloodshed. We know all this when it comes to war. But also, it can contribute to the development of mass and sometimes revolutionary movements. And, when I'm talking to people about what we need in society to change, we need, we talk about it on the show all the time, in the ISA, International Socialist Alternative, we talk about it, we need a socialist revolution. And people say, well, how can we get there? That's daunting. But it is possible to see these revolutionary moments come out of something so terrible like war. And, one example that I've heard, or not example, but quote, it seems like we're using a lot of quotes in this episode, so I'm going to continue, is war is the midwife of revolution. So Connor, can you talk about some examples throughout history where this actually played out?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's a quote that really ties to so many revolutionary movements throughout history. So, I mean, you could go right back to even the Paris Commune, the first time workers really, tried to take power in history. And, this was a situation of war as well between France and Prussia, which was a country at the time. But it was in this context of the war that workers in Paris took power, spurred on by the crisis generated by that war. I mean, most importantly, obviously, I think, is the Russian Revolution and the revolutions that swept Europe following the First World War, like we've been talking about. The Zimmer world left were absolutely right that the working class were going to turn against their respective classes and that and their war. and that the war would be, as you say, the midwife of revolution, and that it was the revolutionary working class who were actually the only force capable of seriously putting an end to that war as well. And you began to see the workers in Russia were seeing that this was the case. They ended up, of course, overthrowing the Tsar, demanding an end to the war. The provisional government that was put in place after the Tsar abdicated wasn't able to provide this because it was, it's a continuation of capitalism and imperialism. And it was actually only a socialist revolution, only the workers coming to power that was able to end that war. And when the Bolsheviks came to power on the back of that revolution, they were able to actually follow through on that promise and did end Russia's involvement in the war. But it was the same all over Europe. In Germany, the war finally ended in the Western Front when the workers there also overthrew their monarch, the Kaiser, and very nearly had themselves a socialist revolution as well. In Italy, you had what was called the 2 Red Years, this kind of revolutionary uprising that broke out in Hungary, in Ireland, all over Europe following the Second World War. There were these huge uprisings of working class people who'd been fighting in this war and kind of being at the sharp end of all of the worst aspects of capitalism, all the most vicious aspects of it, and weren't prepared to put up with this system anymore. And I think you can even make a certain comparison actually to this process that we talk about in more recent times as well. This isn't necessarily a war, but when the pandemic hit, and there was a similar drive of kind of propaganda, this move towards national unity, a kind of whipping up of this idea that we're all in this together, in a very similar way to a war, we made the point that unity that's being kind of put forward by the ruling class is, it's an illusion. That the real class differences at play in this situation would break through in an explosive way, and you'd see big struggles. And it was actually, only a few months later that this idea that we all have the same interest was pretty much shattered following the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, which swept the world, and of course were the biggest social movement in US history. And then, following that, it's just been a series of huge struggles here in the UK, directly actually in response to the government's measures, in total contrast to the idea of national unity over this, people fighting for workplace safety, for decent pay during the pandemic. But also, of course, like mass movements to overthrow corrupt and oppressive governments in Latin America, in Myanmar, and elsewhere. And I think, that is actually an example of a similar process that we see where, these kinds of ideas of national unity and these kinds of phenomena, whether it's war or, as we've seen, like even a pandemic, actually, those ideas do break down, and very explosive struggles can come through that have kind of been building up behind the scenes during those kind of periods. I think that's actually a big part of it, that these struggles do take on an explosive character when they've been bottled up like that. And I think when we talk about revolution or war being the midwife of revolution, that's a big part of it.
Basically what you're saying is it's not necessarily just war leading to revolution, but this sort of oppression that the working class is feeling pushes them into a fight back. And you gave examples of the pandemic, Black Lives Matter movement, and I mean even in the labor movement. Is that what you're saying, Connor?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Obviously, we're not saying that you need a war to have a revolution, but these kinds of phenomena, these crises that are generated by this system that culminate in things like war are often, the kind of spark that can bring these movements about to actually overthrow the system.
Yeah, no, I think those historical examples are a powerful antidote to some of the, very real pessimism people might feel right now, and a certain helplessness that similar. That's why the example of the pandemic was so good. What's going on? How can this change? And I think likewise, when there is ordinary working class people across the world now are looking at what's going on in the Ukraine and looking at the brutal invasion and want to help in some way, but can draw quite understandably pessimistic conclusions about what can be done, and that there's no way out. But I think we discuss particularly about the radicalization and the anti-war sentiment that exists in Russia today, all the thousands of activists that have been arrested. And I think that gives those historical examples gives a bit of a perspective of how, yes, this initial national unity can turn into its opposite, initial support for the ruling class, and in the midst of this nationalist wave can actually give way to, people draw much more revolutionary conclusions. And I think we're already seeing elements of that today, but I think, it's really, I think, helpful to look back at, these historical examples. But I actually want to go to Geert now and ask him about a more recent example. Connor brought us right up to the present, but Geert, I know you were an active participant and organizer in the movement, very powerful movement that developed in opposition to the US invasion of Iraq, which I think, had a huge impact on the consciousness of millions of young people, millions of workers across the world. And we saw millions of them taken to the streets in mass protests and demos. But sadly, that wasn't enough to apply the brakes in the war machine. So I want to know, yes, on the one hand, we see how powerful mass movements can bring an end to a war, but here we saw millions of people on the street and it went ahead. So what were the main differences between this and some of the examples Connor outlined? And what were we arguing for at the time? What were LSP-PSL arguing for at that time in terms of what was the path forward?
Well, first of all, it should be said that the anti-war movement of 2003 didn't start immediately. I mean, it happened after the 9/11 attacks in the United States, which killed thousands of American working people, which caused a shock amongst the working class. And the American ruling class used this shock to launch its war on terror, first in Afghanistan, then in Iraq. At the time of the war in Afghanistan, there was a lot of confusion amongst people because they were still under the influence of the shock of 9/11. It even put a bit of a brake on the anti-globalization movement that was at that moment happening, which was the first movement which was more explicitly anti-capitalist after a decade of mostly one-issue movements. It had its high point in the summer of 2001 with massive protests in Genoa, where our international organization sent a busload of activists to Italy to participate. We wanted to repeat this at the end of 2001 in Brussels during protest against the European Summit. But the war in Afghanistan had put a bit of a brake on the anti-globalization movement, despite all the efforts that we did to continue this movement. But it gradually became clear that the war was not about democracy, was not about fighting reactionary terrorists, most of them who had been supported before by the US, by US imperialism. But it became very clear that it was about the economical interests. And in the case of Iraq, it was very clear that it was about oil, that this was a war on oil for the access to oil. So the invasion of Iraq was prepared for a longer time, and the protests against it grew very quickly. There was an international day of protest in February 2003, 1 month before the war actually started. And this was probably the biggest international day of action ever, with literally millions of people demonstrating against the war all over the world, which was an incredible event to participate in. And we intervened in this with the youth committees that we had built up in the anti-globalization movement, committees that were modeled on the anti-racist committees we had built up in the 1990s when there was an anti-racism movement in Europe. So we took lessons from what we had done before to continue organizing mainly young people at that moment, hundreds of young people, with a program orientated towards the working class and the need of system change. We made it clear that mass protest was important and that young people could play a big role in it, that young people could be a dynamic factor in it. But that to really stop the war, it was necessary to bring the struggle to the workplaces, with strikes, with bringing down the ports, breaking up the logistical operation that every war still is today. That sort of things was necessary, and that still is the case. I mean, now there are some reports, we have to see what is exactly happening, but there are some reports about sabotage actions by railway workers in Belarus, which could be interesting and important, because it has the potential to bring the resistance against war to the workplace and to a place where it's possible to stop the whole military machine of taking place. The anti-war movement in 2003 made it clear that it's not enough to take that the working class is taking to the streets, even with millions of people. That's not enough. In order to win, we need strikes. We have to bring down the whole war machine. We try to popularize this idea by launching school student strikes on day X, which was the beginning of the war. There was a whole campaign of building up towards student strikes on that day, which were very successful. Thousands of young people participated in those protests, for which we took the initiative in Belgium and internationally participated in it as well. But I mean, it didn't come to a revolutionary break with capitalism. That was the big problem. I mean, it was an issue of consciousness, an issue of program. I mean, consciousness was still widely influenced by the whole neoliberal ideological offensive of the 1990s. The working class came to the streets to protest against the war, but not really conscious as its own role as a class. And that was the element that was missing to be able to really stop this war. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that as revolutionary socialists, we think, well, consciousness is not ready yet, so we stand back and wait a little bit. That's not how revolutionary socialists must act. It's also not how consciousness will be brought forward. We took all the opportunities that were present. We took every step that we could take to strengthen the movement, to help us move forward afterwards. That's what we have done with our organization for decades. I mean, the anti-globalization movement was strengthened because of the experience with the anti-racism movement in the 1990s. Anti-globalization movement strengthened the anti-war committees. I mean, it's the same process as I mean, the experience of on a different scale and a different, I mean, you cannot really compare it, but learning from history is what is necessary. I mean, the Russian Bolsheviks always remained optimistic, even at the darkest hours of the war, because they had seen the experience of the Paris Commune. They had seen that war could lead to revolution. They knew that this was the only solution, and they took every possible step towards that. Every opportunity, they took it. That's what we did. Of course, not on the same level. We couldn't make it to a revolutionary break with capitalism, but we tried to build the forces that were able to take a step in that direction. And I think that still is a lesson that we have to take in every movement. Even when we have to go against the stream, we have to take every opportunity to take steps forward with the clear aim of overthrowing this system that is leading to war and misery for the majority of the people.
Thanks very much, Geert. It was great to get that first-hand account of how that movement played out, and particularly what revolutionary socialists were calling for at the time. And I actually think it comes full circle to the first point that you made, which rooted the explanation of war in an understanding of capitalism, the system, and actually from that understanding, you take the strategy to stop it, and points to the role of the working class, because it's our role, us to make society run. It's us who create the profits for the capitalists, and it's also has the potential to bring that system to a halt. And I think bringing that into the anti-war movement is absolutely key. And unfortunately, there wasn't the basis, or was the element that was lacking, as you said, in the anti-war movement in opposition to the invasion of Iraq. But I think it's something that can gain an echo today, and already, we saw some elements of that, particularly workers in Kent refusing to handle Russian oil. And I think that's something young people are more open to today. So I think there's packed full of lessons. This whole episode, I've definitely learned a lot. Toya, what about you? What's obviously we've been discussing historical examples, but I feel like a lot of them are very easy applicable to today. So any particular ones that stand out for you that is helping you make sense of the current situation?
I mean, one theme that we talked about a lot today was this understanding and acknowledgement of who the enemy actually is. Both of our guests explained the problems of World War I, where, the socialists in Europe particularly were unable to really, understand who it was they should be uniting and fighting against. And I feel like I still see that today, talking with my coworkers. It's hard because not only like the whole, I've said this term already today, but the, propaganda machine, like not only like, the 7:00 news that is telling you Russia's bad, Putin's bad, but also just seeing exactly what the Russian military is doing to the Ukrainian people. It's understandable for, the thought process to just be Russia's bad, we have to fight back against Russia, as opposed to taking a step back and looking at the larger imperialist forces at play, the role that U.S. capitalism has played in getting us to this point. I think it's very difficult, and it's a daunting thing to think about. So for me, in order to really build a true anti-war movement, first thing we have to do is acknowledge who the enemy is, who we're fighting against, and that's capitalism. It's not these individual nations that are a particular problem in this particular moment in history. And for me, listening to podcasts like Connor's Revolutionary Ideas or reading revolutionary newspapers like Geert produces in Belgium, I think helps to build that analysis. And I encourage people to check out the International Socialist Alternative website to read our analysis on, the bigger players here and what's needed to fight back. That's my 2 cents, Dara.
Yeah, definitely a lot there. What about Connor and Geert? Connor, what about you? For you, some of the main takeaway lessons from these movements of the past and applying them to today?
Well, I think I agree with what Toya's said. It's thinking about who the real enemy is. Is our enemy the Russian workers that are also, looking for an end to the cost of living crisis, that are, facing government repression, many of whom are actively going out on the streets trying to oppose this war? Well, I think, hopefully it's something that you don't have to be a revolutionary internationalist to say, well, clearly not. But actually, you do have to be a revolutionary internationalist to say, well, okay, so what do we do about this? How do we build a movement to end this war? And I think, that for me is one of the key lessons.
Thanks, Connor. And Geert, I know you've already kind of given us some examples, but I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to highlight that you think is particularly important for the current situation today.
Well, I think most important things have been said, but it's clear that class contradictions do not disappear with war. This whole idea of national unity is used by the ruling class to get support for them in their war, which is only in their interest. It's not in our interest. we have to, we are faced with a choice. Rosa Luxemburg already said we have the choice between socialism and barbarism. And unfortunately, a lot of people can imagine themselves what barbarism looks like. And some may feel a certain despair, a bit, have it difficult with what is happening today. And that's even strengthened with the inflation, with the economical hardship, and all the problems that are happening. We have to explain this is the system. This is how this system is working. We have no other choice than to overthrow this system. We can be optimistic about this because it's not our system that is in crisis. It's not our system that is showing its failures. It's their system. It's the capitalist system. We have the solution for that. We see the possibilities for this, and we have to highlight every element of the potential of the working class, of working class solidarity against all the wars, war in Ukraine, in Yemen, Syria, Libya, the occupation of Palestine. The list is long and is just making the point that people can imagine what barbarism looks like. But we have to imagine what socialism looks like. And we can see small things of this. The solidarity with the refugees today that is bigger. That's an element that we can see. In the First World War, after a few months, when soldiers for a short period left the trenches at Christmas 1914 to play football with each other, the little peace in the Great War that showed some solidarity from below, which was quickly stopped from above. But elements of solidarity from below, working class solidarity, can be seen and are just the first signs of what is to come. Wars show what capitalism has to offer. Those elements of solidarity show what we will have to offer with the working class through our struggle for an international socialist alternative. So we have all the reasons to be hopeful, to be optimistic, despite all the terrible things that are happening today because of how capitalism is organized.
Thanks for leaving us on a good note, Geert, because sometimes when you're talking about this stuff, it's hard to feel optimistic. It's important that we keep that in mind, that a different type of world is possible, a different type of economy is possible, especially in the midst of this, insane war that's happening in Ukraine. So I want to thank both of you for coming on the show with us today, and we hope to have you on again real soon. Well, Dara, what did you think?
Yeah, it was excellent. Two great guests that I think I could listen to speak for a lot longer, and I think I have to admit, some of my personal favorites of previous World to Win episodes are the historical, more theoretical ones. So it was a pleasure to do this one, and look forward to doing more if you'll have me back, of course. So I don't want to count my chickens before they hatch.
Well, it was great having you on. We of course miss Yara, but it was a great episode. And remember, if you haven't heard our previous 3 episodes on the crisis in Ukraine, make sure you tune in there, whether it's YouTube or however you listen to your podcasts. And now we're gonna do our shout out of the week. This week, we are shouting out the 4,000 Minneapolis educators in the U.S. who are out on strike, fighting for better working conditions, fighting for pay raises, fighting back against inflation and bad working conditions. We send huge amounts of solidarity to them, and hopefully we will talk a little bit more about it on a future show. So thank you so much for tuning in to World to Win this week, and we will see you next time. This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternative's YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!